Hi, good afternoon. I'm David Foster, president of the Highstead Foundation and senior conservationist of the Harvard Forest. And I'd like to welcome you to the conversation, Saying Yes to Wildlands and Woodlands. The Harvard Forest and Highstead Foundation are pleased to host this afternoon's program in collaboration with a few of the many partners in the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative, Kestrel Land Trust, the New England Forestry Foundation, and the Northeast Wilderness Trust. With that, I'd like to welcome you again to Saying Yes to Wildlands and Woodlands, which is brought to you by the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative. And I'd like to start by introducing Kristin DeBoer, who will serve as our moderator, and then we'll join with our two conversationalists in discussion in the second part of the program. Kristin is the executive director of the Kestrel Land Trust, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. Since 2006, Kristin has helped Kestrel shift from a volunteer organization to a professionally staffed and an incredibly successful regional land trust. Based in Amherst, Massachusetts, Kestrel helps individuals and communities conserve and care for land across the Connecticut Valley region, from valley farmlands to the expansive forests that occur on the east and west sides of the Connecticut River up into a whole series of rural hill towns. They also help conserve the diverse plant and animal communities that occupy the trap rock ridges of Mount Holyoke and Mount Tom ranges. Kristin has helped Kestrel triple its pace of land protection by forging great partnerships with landowners, towns, state government, and federal agencies, including the Silvio Conte Wildlife Refuge. It's particularly gratifying for me to welcome Kristin because I've known her for a very long time and gotten to know her extremely well, working closely with her over the last couple of years. Her work began at Restore and then moved to the Connecticut Valley and Kestrel, where she's been an active member of the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership and has recently started up a wonderful collaboration with the Harvard Forest and the Highstead Foundation to increase and expand the work of Kestrel across the Connecticut Valley region. Kristin.
Thank you, David, for having me and for that very nice introduction. I am really honored to join the discussion today. It's a conversation about wildlands and woodlands that I've been a part of for 25 years. And I just am here to give you a little context before the main show with John and Bob. So when I first joined the conservation field 25 years ago, I felt like I had walked in on an argument, a fight between two opposing sides, under the title Wilderness versus Working Forest. And at its best, it was a good fight, a principled ideological debate, but other times it became pretty divisive. But fortunately, over the last decade, I have witnessed the discussion evolve to become a much more respectful dialogue that promotes understanding and effectiveness. And I think this is in large part thanks to Harvard Forests and David Foster's work to promote the Wildlands Woodlands vision. In my work as director of Kestrel and as a volunteer board member of the Northeast Wilderness Trust, I have chosen to embrace both woodlands and wildlands. I believe that they both can be healthy outcomes for the land, for water, for wildlife habitat, for recreation, and for climate. And I think we need both approaches if we're going to have a chance at realizing a larger vision to keep most of the forest in New England and the Northeast as forest. So as we listen to this afternoon's speakers, I'd like to ask you to think about forests from a different perspective than maybe your own. Someone in your local community, a resident, a landowner, a member of a land trust. Think of yourself as a funder, a planner, a developer, an activist, or as a person who just enjoys the land or a person who works on the land. All voluntary land conservation is ultimately local, and so it takes all types of people to protect a special place. Kestrel works, as David described, across the Connecticut River Valley, and it looks very different depending on where the land is, who the landowner is, what the community is like, and depending on our public partners. So as a regional land trust, we're generalists. It's our job to do all kinds of projects. We buy land to help expand state parks. We acquire conservation easements over private land, where landowners often choose to keep forestry as an option. Or we expand local parks and trails where outdoor recreation is the priority for people who live nearby. And when we do a project, we have to think about a variety of perspectives. So first, there are the landowners. Voluntary land conservation starts with willing sellers. That starts around the kitchen table. We ask, what do landowners want? What do they want for their family? What do they want for future generations? They think about management. Is a perpetual commitment to forestry or forever wild easier? Which one can they manage? What offers a better financial return? Then there is the funding, because unless the landowner donates the land or an easement, we also need money to make conservation a reality. So we have to ask, what priorities do town, state, and federal agencies have for public funding? And how can private funding help direct the outcome of a project? Then there are the community members, land trust members, sometimes bystanders, and I often wonder, what do regular folks think of forest protection? There's a lot of people on this call, 500 of you. Do you think about wildlands and woodlands every day and just try to distinguish between the two? What do people expect to see when they go to a state park or a town conservation area or a national forest or a national park? Do our experiences recreating outside shape our desires for how wild nature can be? And how can we encourage more people from all backgrounds to care about forests, period? And then last but not certainly least, there's the science. What does ecology tell us about wildlife habitat would be best suited for wildlands or woodlands? What does the climate emergency call upon us to do? How can forest conservation stem the decline of biodiversity? And how does this science, the science that we have to abide by, match up with the landowner's desires, the funding sources, and the community support? So it's a big puzzle, and if we're lucky, all the pieces come together. I will share two quick examples before introducing John and Bob. One is we've worked with major funding from the Federal Forest Legacy Program to help the state acquire a conservation restriction over the Paul C. Jones Working Forest, which is owned by W.D. Coles, the largest timberland owner in Massachusetts. And at 3,486 acres, it's also the largest CR over private land in the Commonwealth. On a smaller scale in Whately, this year, we're working with two leaders in old growth protection, Monica and Bob Leverett, who created a dedicated fund to help Kestrel and the town purchase and protect 120 acres and make it forever wild. This patch of wildlands is located right in the center of a rural village, and local residents agreed to use the town funding as well to ensure that this will be a place where children can grow up alongside a wild forest, where they can actually see for themselves how big and old mature trees can actually become. So as you listen this afternoon, I'd like to ask yourself to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Think about where you live. What would be the ideal balance of woodlands and wildlands and the forests that are closest to your home? Would your neighbors agree with your ideal? Who owns the land? And how could you help realize that vision in your neck of the woods? Thanks for giving me that opportunity to set the stage. And now I'd like to introduce our two main speakers. So Bob Perschel, I've known, I think since I started a long time ago, have great respect for his work. He's the executive director of the New England Forestry Foundation. He's worked as a conservation professional for 40 years, focusing on large landscape protection, wilderness preservation, sustainable forestry practices, ecological forestry practices, and exemplary forestry practices, and their relation to climate change. Bob has 2 degrees from Yale, a master's in forestry and a psychology degree. He ran his own forest consulting business and co-founded the Forest Stewards Guild. And more than 20 years ago, when I knew him, at first, he was the regional director of the Wilderness Society and served as chair of the Northern Forest Alliance. Most recently, Bob has guided the New England Forestry Foundation's Forest to Cities and Build It with Wood campaigns, which you'll hear about tonight. I think Bob is zooming in from his home office in Massachusetts. John Leibowitz is the executive director of Northeast Wilderness Trust. And I first met him out in Montana doing a leadership training with the Land Trust Alliance a few years ago. Before joining the trust, he was the director of the Montezuma Land Conservancy in Colorado, and he has a degree from Vermont Law School. John now serves on the Rewilding Leadership Council and the board of Vermont Parks Forever. At Northeast Wilderness Trust, which was founded in 2002 and has already protected over 37,000 acres as Forever Wild, John is leading an incredible expansion to better serve all of New England and New York. Tonight, you'll hear about the newest initiative, the Wildlands Partnership, which is creating incentives for land trusts like my own to protect our own lands as Forever Wild. And John is zooming in with us from Vermont. So I'll be back at the Q&A. Just a reminder that you can submit questions at the bottom of your screen. And I'm sure you're eager to hear what Bob and John have to share with you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Bob Perschel. It's a real privilege to be with you this afternoon. When we heard there might be 600 people, we were a little bit amazed, but I guess it speaks to the interest that we have in this region. And we're looking forward to spending some time with you. Today's session is an outgrowth of conversations that John and I have been having around the table at the Wildlands and Woodlands group. Every few months, David Foster brings us together for conversations about where to go and how to map our path forward. And John and I got to know each other there. Our two organizations had a longer history and worked together protecting land together. But John and I got to know each other around the table. As we had some board members that shared joint board positions on each organizations, and we'd hear from them that they kept encouraging Neff and Newt to work together and protect more land. And so John and I would talk about what would be the next thing we could do together. And we're still talking about that and have some ideas. But one of the things that popped us for us that maybe the most important thing that we could do was to talk about the partnership and the respect we have for each other and the respect that the two organizations have for each other and how that's enabled us to really do good things on the landscape. And that maybe we should get together and figure out how to do that and take an opportunity to move forward to do that. And one of the things we decided that to make the point, we would shift roles right at the beginning. And I would speak for wilderness and John would speak for forestry. It sounded like a good idea. I didn't know John that well, but when I heard that he used wood to heat his home, I figured he was okay, because I knew he was a great wilderness advocate, and I figured he got the forestry angle of it too. So that's my short introduction before I shift into my other role. But John, please go ahead and take over for a minute.
Thanks, Bob. So, why is Northeast Wilderness Trust here presenting with New England Forestry Foundation? Both organizations approach land conservation with different strategies, and some may say opposing strategies, but ultimately we are both trying to do the same thing, which is prevent forest conversion of private land around New England. You're going to hear Bob talk a lot about a systems approach to conservation, and we refer to this as a holistic approach, but the meaning is the same. Those that support wildlands and those that support managed woodlands must find common ground and work together to solve the twin crises of our time, which is climate change and biodiversity loss. And we are out of time, and that's why we're here talking together. We don't necessarily agree on everything, Bob and I, but that is okay. And that's the whole point of this conversation. Someone on my side, if I will, for a second, the wild side of the conversation, errantly, lump all forestry practices together and fail to see the nuance between different types of management. And some on the management side, Bob's side, think that every forest left alone and allowed to grow old and rewild is an affront to humanity. And this presentation is our attempt to say, no more to both of those positions. No strategy alone is going to solve the problems that we face, and we need to work together. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to let Bob tell you all why he loves wilderness so much.
Which is an easy thing to do. As Kristin said in my introduction, I've spent quite a few years working for the Wilderness Society here in New England. So in my career, I've kind of moved back and forth across roles, put on a little bit of different hat every time, but still respect both ends of this spectrum. When I was at TWS, as Kristin said, I was the regional director, but I kind of worked myself out of that role at one point into a national role where I took over a national program for the Wilderness Society called the Land Ethic Program, which gave me a really wonderful chance to investigate what wilderness really meant to people, to talk to poets and writers, religious people, spiritual guides, Native Americans, and kind of explore backwards to the origins of wilderness and what we meant by that. One of the things I discovered as I did that as I asked people what the value of wilderness was, they'd usually list 5 things. And what was unusual was there was one of them that was always listed number 5. And it was usually the spiritual, the ethical, the emotional, that connection that people really feel strongly about, but they'd always kind of tuck it at the end. If you read any books or chapters, it gets the last paragraph. It gets the last thin chapter in the book. So what we decided to do at TWS is to take a deep dive and to explore that particular angle of wilderness and the value of wilderness. And I produced a book called The Land Ethic Toolbox. It's a little sort of toolkit, not a real book. I still have copies. If anybody wants one, I can get one to you. But from that perspective, I'm going to talk about right now the 5 values of wilderness, but I want to put that one at the beginning. Let's put that one maybe where it deserves to be put, because that's what's coming from our hearts. And I think that's what directs us most of the time. So there's a spiritual, an ethical, emotional, some might call it a religious aspect to wilderness. It's what we feel in our heart. I think it's really important to us to acknowledge that and to kind of absorb that and make sure that we understand that's why it's important to protect wilderness, so that we can have a relationship with nature that's directly connected to nature and not filtered through changes in the land that we might make as human beings. I think that's essential, particularly in this day and age. It's something my wife and I thought about a lot when we had our child, that this was a human being and we loved him and we wanted certain things for him, but he's an individual. He was going to think for himself. He's going to feel for himself. He was going to find his own way through the world. And we needed to let go at different times during his life and let him find his own path. Maybe I learned a little bit of that through my wilderness advocacy. So when you learn to set aside land and stay away from it, maybe you will learn some other things in your life about how to deal with people and your family, et cetera. I think I have, and I think it's been valuable for me. So I think there's a whole aspect of wilderness that's really key to who we are as individuals, to who we are as people, to who we are as a country. This idea started in this country, and it's a really important part of what we all stand for. So I put it number 1, but it's not the only value. There's other reasons. There's 4 more. One of them is the pure science value. If we want to understand the world, if we want to understand nature, we have to be able to leave it alone a little bit and just observe it, be able to measure it, see what it does without any other interaction to it. And that makes us understand what the world is all about. And that's an unfiltered view of it. So just for that reason, it's important to have land that we can look at. Another reason for it is we need to use wilderness to protect certain wildlife and biodiversity. They need to be left alone, some species. They need not to be interrupted. And we're able to identify some of them that have these wildlife requirements, these habitat requirements. And we need to provide them the places, particularly in a time of climate change, where it's going to be tougher for them. So we know something, and there's a lot of things we don't know. There are a lot of species we haven't identified yet, let alone understanding what their requirements are to survive. And so we just need to leave land alone so that they have a chance until we can figure all that out. So that's another reason to protect wildlife. The other one is a practical utilitarian reason. It has to do with forestry. We need to be able to study the natural world untouched in order to understand how we can manage it when we do decide to step in and manage it. We do different things with forests and use different techniques, but we don't really understand them well until we see how a forest functions without us doing anything. So that helps us become better forest managers. That's directly linked to forestry. We need those lands left aside. And the last one, the fifth one, is I just call it joy, enjoyment. It's about recreation. It's getting out there on the land and hiking and skiing and maybe being alone, maybe, as they say, being in a place where you can get lost, where you can find yourself by getting lost. All those different activities that's, purely for our own personal use and own personal enjoyment, but we love them. And I think they're important, and they should be available to everybody in our society. We hear a lot of talk now and focus about diversity and inclusion and justice. And I know a lot of groups and people are focusing on that. Making sure our natural lands are available and people are comfortable going there is something we need to do some more thinking about and be better at. But these lands that we're setting aside are for everybody, for all time, for all future generations. So those are my 5 reasons why I love wilderness, why I've spent my career supporting it, why NEF supports Newt, why NEF supports more reserves, and why we have this partnership with John. Over to you, John.
Thanks, Bob. All right, so I will, for a few minutes, put on my imaginary forestry hat. And I want to pose a question to each of you, especially to the fellow wilderness supporters that are listening. For the foreseeable future, whether good or bad, you and I will continue to use wood products every single day. Cardboard boxes, household paper, building materials, furniture, sporting equipment. These are all, of course, made of trees. So I ask, where should tree resources come from and how should we procure them? To me, the answer is that this resource should be procured as ecologically sustainable as possible and ideally as local as possible. We can either pretend that we aren't doing harm elsewhere while using wood products, or we can choose to get these products from our own backyard right here in the Northeast, ideally using the highest standards possible with land trusts like New England Forestry Foundation leading the way. And at the same time, we should ensure that the wood grown in New England is used here in New England. And as Bob will present, cutting trees carefully with great respect for the forests in which they're grown and for the creatures that call those places home, and importantly, using those wood products wisely is an incredible complementary conservation strategy to wildlands conservation. And this can help solve climate change. Does that mean that all forestry is perfect and it's exactly the same? No, of course it doesn't. But not all forestry practices are equal. And I believe, and I'm a supporter of NEF's exemplary forestry standard, and I think it should be a model that we try to expand, and one, again, that I personally support. Like many, I have gone out of my way to reduce virgin wood products from my daily life, and especially at Northeast Wilderness Trust. But as one example, as Bob alluded to, I burn wood for heat. I personally love felling trees in the forest behind my house, and I love being kept warm throughout the long Vermont winter with those trees. And I think it's unarguably the most local and affordable heat source available to me. And while for me, it's a privilege and a choice that I make to burn wood for heat, for many across New England, keeping warm with wood is an economic necessity and, again, a better local solution than burning oil or propane. So I use that one example, and there are, of course, many, to make a simple point, and it's not to make myself out to be a hypocrite. The point is that no matter your love for wild places and the unquestionable value of those places, and the urgent need to protect exponentially more wild places, we live in a world that uses wood products. And I do believe that there should be a shift in the consumption of wood, but wood is and will remain a useful product. And I thus believe that we need to procure it as wisely as we can and use it as wisely as we can. I don't think that out of sight, out of mind is a conservation strategy. So if we're going to solve climate change and help wildlife, we need to embrace an approach that integrates both the protecting of trees and those ecosystems, wilderness conservation, and the wise harvesting and the wise use of trees, forestry. And that's why Bob and I are here together, and that's why I support NEF's push for exemplary forestry standards as a complementary strategy to conserving more wild places. I think that is what is holistic conservation thinking. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Bob now, and we're going to get into the core presentations on both New England Forestry Foundation, and I'll follow up with Northeast Wilderness Trust. Thanks.
Thanks, John. So now each of us will talk about our particular areas of interest and activism. My job is to talk a little bit about climate change at the beginning that will serve for both of us. I have a number of slides. Some of them are complicated. I'm using them as sort of illustrative purposes. Don't try to read everything on them. We don't have enough time for that. You can obtain the slides. I'd be happy to talk to you offline. Send me an email. We can dig into some of these things. But I'll be using them pretty quickly to make some points here. And I'm also assuming that the audience we have today has heard a lot about climate change already and understands a lot of the things we're talking about. So I'm not going to linger on them. But here's a little primer on climate change. We've had a bad year in climate change, and we're up against it. Humanity will also now have to find ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere if we're going to meet our goals. So what this means is we're going to be looking at, the human race will be looking at a lot of things, including forests, and asking a lot of questions about forests. And the primary question here is going to be, how can the forest of New England help to mitigate climate change in the next 10 to 30 years? That is the time period. And so we'll be asked in terms of forestry and in terms of wilderness, how this can be helpful. So we need to prepare for that. Thinking about climate change has proven to be very difficult for the average citizen. And there's been research on that. Even the brightest students at MIT and Harvard, when asked basic questions about climate change, don't seem to get it. But one of the useful ways that people have come up with talking about it is like a bathtub. You know, human race is turning the tap and putting the water into the tub. Forest, oceans, and even rocks and minerals absorb some of that climate. That's the net removal. That's the water coming out of the tub. The problem is that we're putting it in faster than those natural systems are absorbing it. The water is getting higher in the tub, and it's causing us problems. That's the simplest aspect of this. When you actually consider what we're going to do about it, it becomes very complicated. There are many bathtubs connected to each other, all interacting with each other. And it looks something like this. Well, the example is, if you have an electric car and you're proud of it, and you decide you'll drive it 100 miles, and then you're asked, what did you do for climate change? And you say, nothing came out of my tailpipe, it's wonderful. Well, that's not the end of that story. Where did the electricity, and that's the next bathtub, come from that powered your car? Was it powered by coal or oil or gas? Maybe it was powered by wind or solar. That's great. Maybe it was nuclear. Where did it come from? You'd have to figure that out in order to understand what your effect of driving those 100 miles are. You'd also have to look into the manufacture of the car. How much energy was used to build that car and to build that tremendous battery that's below the car? If you've ever taken a look at it, it's like the whole bottom of the car. Energy and carbon was put into the atmosphere to make that car. How much? You'd have to know that. And the last one is, where did those materials come from? These electric batteries are using rare earth minerals and other minerals that come from around the world, some of them from isolated places, some of them where 60% of that material comes from the Republic of Congo. What happened when those minerals were actually mined? Was that fair to the population in that area? Did it destroy wildlife habitat? What was the carbon? What was the climate? What was the biological and biodiversity effects of obtaining those minerals? Once you've done that whole study, then you'd have an idea of how you're helping or neutral or hurting climate change. So what I'm asking for you today is to think about these bathtubs, but let's narrow this down a bit. Let's just think about two bathtubs. The one on the left is the carbon that's actually in the forest. And the one on the right is the carbon that's in the materials and the products that we use, or the pollution that might be in the materials and products that we use. And there's a balance back and forth between these two. If you use more non-wood products, you're using something else. And if that's negative to climate, you might have a worse effect than you expect to do that. So we have to think about that as well. There are other connections here, but we're not going to get more complicated than this today. But let's continue along that line. I'm going to go through the next few slides quickly because I think you've seen something like this before. We're in an urgent climate emergency. Whether we can meet these climate limits that we think are important not to go beyond is really becoming more questionable every day. And the longer we wait and keep polluting the atmosphere, the harder it's going to get back to a safe place. The curve gets steeper and it's harder to get to there in the right place, which means we're going to have to figure out new ways to absorb that carbon, not just stopping our emissions, but actually absorbing what's in the air already. We've got the Paris agreements. Hopefully our country will get back on board. That's not going to be enough. We're going to have to work even harder to do that, but at least it's a start, but we'll have to do better. What we're all aiming for is to avoid these kind of tipping points that might come within the next 10 or 30 years. And if these things are hit, all bets are off. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. You've all heard this before, but this is why it's really imperative that we all do the right thing in New England, both in our wildlands and in our forest. We need to chart a path that brings us to this place, what's called the stabilized earth path. So then the question becomes, how can our forest help us get there? What are we going to do? All right. At NEF, we ask that question all the time. We've been around for a while, so we know a thing or two about New England. We've helped protect a lot of land. We managed land for many, many decades. We have over 142 community forests around the region. This is an old map. We just closed on some lands in the down east area of Maine where you don't see many of those green dots. Now we have community forest in those areas there. So we're covering New England pretty well. We started off by doing this report, looking at forest in New England and figuring out how they were advantageous to society and how they could help us on the path to sustainability. And we found 10 or 12 of them. We decided we would focus on one of them, which is building more with wood, which turned out to be a good decision when we made it 6 years ago. So let's dig into that a little bit more. What we're saying is that there's a real prime climate opportunity here for New England and the globe, but we can be leaders. What we need to do is a simple equation. We have to stop forest conversion. We have to stop losing forest land to development. I think we all agree on that one. The second one is we have to introduce exemplary forestry standards. And we think about that as both managing lands better and setting lands aside not to manage. When foresters say they practice forestry, part of that is inclusive. It's also deciding what not to harvest, what to set aside. So we include Newt's mission under that second circle there. And the third thing we need to do is to build wood buildings, replace steel and concrete buildings. If we can get this systems approach moving in New England, and it's starting, we can have a big climate wedge that we can bring to bear. This is your Forestry 101 primer. This is a forest stand, pictures taken over 40 years. Most of our work is, almost all of our work is in natural forest stands that have regenerated naturally. What we do is we go in, we harvest and we thin early on, then we come back and thin a little bit later and wait another 10 or 20 years and thin a little bit more. Our objective is to move the growth onto the better formed, faster growing trees. And that man in that picture is standing in front of the same tree 20 years apart. So this is the progression through the forest. Now the forest is increasing in carbon. We're paying attention to wildlife and we're producing valuable products that actually can be useful in replacing fossil fuel intensive products. We continue this into the next 20 years. Now your forest at 60 to 80 years begins to look something like this. And for some forests, we keep going until we have really large trees. That's basically what we're doing and what it's all about for us in New England. Here's a chart that's really revealing. When we look at New England and the states of New England, what we're finding is that most of the harvesting is being done in the northern states, less harvesting in the southern states. But when we look at consumption, you find that most of the consumption is in the southern states, Mass and Connecticut, and less of the consumption is in Maine, where most of the harvesting is. So it's kind of a reverse negative in the region, which presents us with some opportunities here. Because when you look at the map of carbon that's in the forest of New England, this is what you see. Look at the bluish areas up in Western Maine. That means there's low carbon per acre up there because the landowners in that region are harvesting younger trees, heavier, and the forest isn't growing back. Look at Western Massachusetts. There's density of carbon there, mostly because a lot of landowners are doing nothing. They're not managing their land. They're not producing products. The trees are just growing. That's not a bad thing, but it's not a good thing if you're talking about products. Swing yourself over to the Boston Bay area and look at that area. That's where most of the consumption is. There's not a lot of carbon, not that many forests in there, but that's where the consumption is. What if we, for example, tied each of these three regions together? What if we provided incentives to the landowners in Western Maine to change their forestry practices and let more carbon grow in the forest? They can still continue to harvest materials under exemplary forestry. They can still continue to be profitable, but they'll harvest in a different way and pack carbon into those stands. They'll need some economic incentives to do that. We think they'd be willing if they had the right incentives. That's a tremendous climate wedge. Move yourself down to Western Massachusetts. If we could educate and bring these people to thinking more about their forests, some of them would join John and make their lands wildlands, but most of them wouldn't. But we might be able to convince them to introduce them to exemplary forestry practices, to hire an expert forester, and to begin to manage their land so that they can produce products that then would go into Boston. So then you have this flow. The money flows out of Boston to get the carbon benefits for the consumption into the rural areas, and the products flow back into Boston to build wood buildings instead of steel and concrete buildings. We're beginning to model what that would look like. What kind of climate impact would that look like? Here's where you start. You'll have to look at the gross growth in each state. You can do this by property if you wanted to. what's growing there. You have to subtract the natural mortality. A lot of times people don't do that, but trees die each year. That gives you your net growth in the third column. So where we are now is you've got your net growth. If you were setting it aside for wilderness, you would stop there, and that would be your climate impact, where your net growth column is. But if you're harvesting material, you're reducing carbon from the forest, so you have to subtract the removals. Now you have your net carbon sink. That's what's happening in the forest under a managed forest. But you can't stop there either. You need to go to a broader equation. You take the carbon sink number, you add in the carbon that stays sequestered in the forest products. You have to ask how long it will be. And then you add in the substitution benefits. If you're not making a steel beam and you're replacing it with a wood beam, you're getting a major substitution benefit. That would give you your net climate impact. And what we're saying is, for some lands, setting this up can have a major climate effect. So what we're really trying to do is optimize that equation for New England. And you think of the ways to do that. Number one, stop harvesting and let the forest grow. We'll do that on more lands. We should do that. And it's more helpful to biodiversity and wildlife. Let's do that. We'll get a climate impact there. But on the other lands that are going to be managed, let's improve the forestry on it. We'll increase the production. We'll raise the carbon in the forest, and we'll produce more forest products that can be used to offset other products. That's all to the good. The third thing is we need to use more products that substitute for the most long-lived and carbon-polluting products, like steel and concrete. Right now, today, we don't have the building codes that support this, but in a few weeks, we may. The state in New England can adopt new codes. So there's opportunities for us here. When we want to think about what to do in forestry, we start with the wildlife habitat. So we're going to build a set of standards, which NEF has done, in order to make this happen and make the forest safe while we're doing it. So we do the studies and look at what's happening on a particular landscape and what the wildlife needs are. This is an example of what we've done for that area in Western Maine. We found out that older trees are scarce, patch sizes are low, and the stand distribution does not match what the wildlife ecologists say would be optimum. We can change all that through forestry practices. We dig a little bit deeper. We consider all the species in the forest, what the full biodiversity, and there are guides for that. We integrate that into there. We move to our forestry practices. This is a chart of how to manage a forest. We know that forests grow really well when it's between that green and the red line as far as stocking, and doesn't do very well and loses productivity when it goes below. So we want to keep it between the green and the red lines. That's forestry, simple forestry facts. We put all these things together and we come up with exemplary forestry standards. They're listed on our website. I won't go through this, but these are the kind of standards that can give us wildlife benefits plus climate benefits in the short term if we can move there with these standards. This is the most important chart and graph here that I want you to see. What this tells us is the higher your stocking in your forest, the more trees, the denser they are, the more productive your forest is. So this is a great reason why forest owners should want to manage according to exemplary forestry standards at higher stocking, because their forests will be more productive and earn them more money. The reason why they don't do that in some cases is because there's a gap. They need to cut now in order to pay their bills, and they don't let the trees grow long enough. So we see the red triangle, which is the average for Maine, for example, when that star is our target for exemplary forestry. How do we get landowners to move on that curve from the red triangle to the purple star? It's going to require some financial incentives, but if we can move them, we get a big climate impact. We get improved wildlife, we get more carbon in the forest, and they get their forest to a point where it's much more productive, much more valuable, they earn more money, and they're likely to want to stay there. Here's the proof. These are NEF lands and another ownership at the bottom. We've tracked these standards over time. And what we can see and prove to you and bring you out to these properties is that over the time, our initial stocking has gone way up on these properties. We have a lot more carbon in these forests now than when we acquired them, but we've harvested quite a bit of material in these forests. This is the proof that you can do both and move these along. We want to spread this outside of NEF properties to other properties. If we take these concepts and model them out for Western Maine, we see what begins to happen. These forests begin to store more carbon over time, and we reach a better place in a big climate mitigation wedge. In lands like in Massachusetts, unlike the ownerships in Maine, there's been modeling done by that too, by Harvard Forest and the state. And what it's shown that over a 50-year modeling period, when you get to the end of that 50 years, there's a little bit less carbon in the forest. That's that tree there. It's a little bit shorter on the right than the tree on the left, right, all over on the left. A little bit less carbon in the forest, but we've produced twice as much products. That's the board at the bottom. Now, if you take those products and use them to replace other materials like steel and concrete, you get a better outcome in a climate wedge. So if we begin to think of these things, I'm going to save some time here. I had a list of conservation and forestry myths and illusions. These are the things we tell each other that aren't really true, but I didn't want to dig into them and spend the time. But the one I will mention is the illusion of preservation. If we protect land and set it aside without harvesting it in Massachusetts, we don't get the products from that property. But society still demands them, so they're just moved somewhere else, down the road to Maine, like you see on the chart, or to Alabama or the Amazon. So ultimately, that's not a climate impact. So we need to think about that. But the real question we need to focus on is, what does the atmosphere see from anything that we're doing, like setting land aside, like practicing better forestry, like conserving land. And so when we think about it in that terms, I know for certain if we practice better forest management than we are now, it'll increase the productivity of the site, and it will change what the atmosphere sees just because we're growing more material. The caveat is it has to protect ecological values and products and use products to offset the climate damaging ones. So you don't get away here scot-free. You have to do the right thing for wildlife. The solution in New England is exemplary forestry and building with wood. So let's take a look at that. Over the next 30 years, there's going to be 2.5 billion more people on this planet, and they're all going to need a place to live. A lot more people will move into cities and demand more housing and more construction and more infrastructure. We've got a big problem that's not going away. We need to solve this problem. If we continue to build like this with steel and concrete, we will not solve the climate problem. We need an alternative, and the only alternative that I can figure out and that anybody has presented to me is to use wood. If somebody says hemp, we can talk about that, but hemp can't do the job. But I often hear of hemp. So here's the solution. These new engineered wood materials can build these buildings. They can go up tall. They can take the place of steel and concrete. Not all steel and concrete, but a lot of it, and get the climate benefits. So these are examples. Here are the buildings around the world that are already built. We don't have a lot of them in the US or New England yet, but they're beginning to come. These are beautiful spaces, beautiful interiors. Studies are now showing that people that work in these wood buildings where the wood is shown and evident actually are more productive and more healthy. There's less absenteeism. They get more work done. That could be a tremendous advantage if that's the case. You know, to wrap it up at the end, there's an opportunity for us to work together to accomplish this. You It's being done across the landscape where people have formed great partnerships to protect wildlands and woodlands. Up in Maine, Appalachian Mountain Club has done a fantastic job on 100,000 acres and major reserves on that property. We could go through a number of those things. My call would be for the 500 or 600 people on this call to work together on this. If we split up, there's only 200 or 250 of us. If we work together, there's over 500. And if we bring our colleagues in, there's thousands or tens of thousands. So that's the pathway to the future. And I hope we can work together for it.
Thanks, Bob. All right. So, Forever Wild Conservation, also referred to as Wildlands, of course. So I'm going to start my discussion on wilderness with a brief history of New England, a region that until very recently, and for thousands of years prior, was home to diverse cultures of indigenous peoples and a full suite of biodiversity, from apex predators like the catamount and wolf, on down to, of course, the tiniest creatures living amongst old and complex forests, beauty dominated by largely natural processes. And in what is essentially an ecological split second, really less than a split second, all across the Northeast, European settlers cleared upwards of 3/4 of the landscape. And by the late 1800s, in a race to domesticate that landscape for agriculture, produce charcoal and cut timber, the landscape had changed quite a bit. In Vermont, as one example, few forests at all below 2,000 feet elevation existed by the 1800s. This is an incredible photo of the White River from a century ago during one of those many log drives. And it's actually taken right around where my family now spends a lot of weekends swimming during the summer. This photograph is important to the presentation as it's a reminder that wilderness conservation in New England is not about conserving pristine landscapes, nor is it anywhere else, and nor has it ever been. Here's a picture of the White River today, the longest free-flowing tributary to the Connecticut in all of its full and reforested glory. So the recovery of northeastern forests, like the previous image of the white, is a story of hope and healing and rewilding. Bill McKibben says that the Adirondacks are perhaps the world's greatest experiment in ecological recovery, a place hard used a century ago and now slowly recovering, slowly proving that where humanity backs off, nature rebounds. And the same could be said for all of New England and indeed anywhere across the United States or the planet. It is true, thankfully, that our forests have regrown, but they have not fully recovered. And even with the amazing reforestation that has occurred across New England, the reality is that most of our forests are just teenagers between the age of 50 and 100. And also fascinating to consider is that though forested again, most of these forests will remain teenagers indefinitely under active management. Less than 1% of the entire Northeast is old growth. But we, everyone on this call, can change that. There is room for more wild forests, more old forests, and more predators to bring balance back to our home region. And this will happen by continuing to be intentional about rewilding the Northeast. Rewilding has been occurring in our region since farmers began abandoning their fields for greener pastures out west through a process often referred to as benign neglect. And this process was accelerated, of course, by the active work of conservationists going back to the creation of the Adirondack Park and the passage of the Weeks Act and other examples. Simply put, rewilding means allowing nature the necessary space to heal and restore the life-supporting functions it provides. Rewilding also means redefining our relationship with nature and recognizing that we are one species among many. At its core, rewilding is what Northeast Wilderness Trust is engaged in, and we're part of an international effort to bring wildness back across the planet. These are a few of the organizations that work on this kind of stuff. Northeast Wilderness Trust is a proud endorser of the recently released Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth. And I want to take a moment to read its vision statement of the charter. It says that we believe that the world can be more beautiful, more diverse, more equitable, more wild. We believe that nature's innate resilience, bolstered by human care, can initiate an era of planetary healing. In that future time, when the world is whole and healthy, undammed rivers will run to the sea, their estuaries teeming with life. Following ancient patterns, whales and warblers will migrate unmolested through sea and sky, from tiny phytoplankton to the tallest redwoods. All Earth's creatures will be free to pursue lives of quality, and humanity will thrive amidst nature's abundance. It's a beautiful vision, and I share it because that is what wilderness conservation is all about. So let's put wilderness conservation in context. How much is conserved in the Northeast? Here's a map that shows all of the conserved lands of our region, both public and private, and it's quite impressive. Roughly a quarter of New England is conserved in some way, but the vast majority of conserved forests are managed woodlands. That's not a knock against them, it's just a statement of fact. And remember what I said earlier, most of these forests are in teenage limbo and will remain so because of active management. Only a small fraction are preserved as forever wild. And as you'll soon see, there are incredible benefits to allowing forests to grow and remain unmanaged. So let's pull back a layer. Here is that exact same map with the exact same data showing all the wilderness and wildlands conservation. Roughly 2 to 3% of our region is protected as wilderness or equivalent. So of all the conservation, 97 of it is open to management and 3% of it is wild. I would say that that's a rather bleak picture. However, I do want to repeat my critical message that I started with. I present this map to illustrate the incredible lack of wildlands and not to attack managed woodlands. It is not an either-or situation, and both strategies are needed to fulfill a hopeful vision and a resilient future for New England. Conserving well-managed woodlands, as Bob just talked about, is a much-needed complementary strategy to the expanded conservation of wildlands, and I can't emphasize that enough. Yet I say that with a huge asterisk, which is simply look at the map. The amount of permanently protected wild forests in the Northeast is woefully inadequate, most of it being in the Adirondacks, and we must start conserving far more urgently. So what exactly is wilderness when I keep using this word? In its most brief, it is land that is left to its own will. The root of the word wilderness means will of the land, self-willed forests. In a wild landscape, trees grow old and die on their own time frames. Species form multiple generations. Forest complexity increases. Niche habitats are naturally created, and coarse woody debris dominates the landscape. Natural disturbances create dynamic multi-age forests, and all of this stuff, biomass, complexity, it increases year after year. Wilderness is where nature, not people, direct the ebb and flow of life. There's no forestry, there's no extraction, and there's no motors on wild places. So when speaking of New England, we know, as I just said, that practically all of it has been cut over and most of it continues to be heavily managed. And that begs the question, can wilderness even exist here in New England, a region of millions of people with millions of acres of young forest and millions of miles of roads everywhere? And the simple answer is, of course. Wilderness conservation does not rest on finding places that were left untouched over the last 400 years, or off in a remote corner of New England, or even places that were absent human settlement before Europeans arrived. That is not true out west, and it is not true here in the East. Howard Zahniser, author of the Wilderness Act of 1964, who is pictured here at his family cabin in the Adirondacks, consciously used the obscure word untrammeled in the law's definition of wilderness. He did not say pristine or ancient or untouched, but untrammeled. And something that is trammeled is bound or caught, and something that is untrammeled is free or unimpeded. The primary characteristic of wilderness is freedom, freedom for the land to follow its own evolutionary path. At Northeast Wilderness Trust, we say that wilderness is not simply a special kind of place, but rather a special commitment we make to a place. And that commitment is freedom to animals and to the natural processes that produce integrity, beauty, and diversity of the land community. So if wilderness is a choice, then wilderness by definition can be found anywhere where humans decide to make this choice. It's a place for humans, we decide to practice humility and to observe self-control, and to recognize the hubris of believing that not only we know how to manage every landscape, but that we should manage every landscape. The moment that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects a place, we are taking an intentional step, a radical one, to step aside and let nature control its destiny. That is the essence of our work, like on this stunning property in Southeast Massachusetts. On this property, 36 vernal pools and a great coastal plain pond are found amidst 350 acres. That also happens to be right next to a highway and a housing development and a Walmart. And even in this urban context, as constrained as nature may be, wildlife flourishes, and Muddy Pond Wilderness Preserve is indeed wilderness or wildlands or forever wild. So what does that actually look like on the ground in action? This is an image of Howland Research Forest, a property that we own in Maine, and it's to the right of the green line with managed forest surrounding it. Our standard prohibitions largely mimic the Wilderness Act of 1964, and on our preserves, there are no horses, vehicles, no bicycles, no tree cutting, no agriculture of any kind, no mining, no extractive uses, no grazing, and no trapping. These occur all over the landscape, on conserved places, on unconserved places, in various places. So what's left? In wilderness, there is quiet, muscle-powered recreation, hunting of abundant prey species where appropriate, scientific research, canoeing, cross-country skiing, birding, photography, etc. Wildlands offer a place to develop a reciprocal relationship with land, a relationship that is not based on domination, extraction, or even personal benefit. Wilderness is a place that exists because it simply has a right to, and that we visit on its own terms with deep respect. So why should you care about this? What do wildlands have to do with climate change or biodiversity? Why should you participate? Intrinsic value is the big reason. Wild forests simply have a right to exist, as I just said, and while Northeast Wilderness Trust proudly protects nature for nature's sake, we also celebrate the many reasons that protecting wild places are beneficial to people. Biodiversity, resilience, carbon storage, reciprocity. Over the past 5 years, there has been an almost endless amount of peer-reviewed science that's published that speaks to the unparalleled value of old and wild and unmanaged forests when it comes to carbon storage and sequestration. These studies were synthesized by Northeast Wilderness Trust last year, authored by Mark Anderson, our board president, who also is the director of science at the Nature Conservancy for the Eastern United States. And it's available to download on our website. It's fascinating. I encourage you to check it out. Today, I'm just going to talk about the 5 conclusions that Mark reached. The first one is that trees accumulate carbon over their entire lifespan. The second is that old forests accumulate carbon and contain vast quantities of it. The third is that old forests accumulate carbon in soils. Forests share carbon among and between tree species, and that forest carbon can help slow climate change. After all the science was synthesized by Mark, he concluded that conserving unmanaged wild forests is a useful, scalable, and cost-effective complementary strategy to the continued conservation of good and well-managed forests, as Bob was talking about. The simple action of doing nothing holds a lot of promise. Simply letting forests that already exist around New England grow old, wild, complex, into their full ecological potential is in an unmanaged state, has great scientifically backed and peer-reviewed potential as a natural climate solution. And it's also comparatively inexpensive. So I want to talk about biodiversity and resiliency. Look at this scene, this beautiful, old, messy, mossy forest. This is what wild, resilient forests brimming with life look like. At least this one forest, again, taken from our Howland Research Forest. And it really captures a lot of why wild forests are so important for biodiversity. Howland was purchased by Northeast Wilderness Trust in 2007 to protect it from being logged. And it's home to trees that were just approaching middle age when Henry David Thoreau wrote those words at the bottom of your screen describing the Maine woods. So what is so unique about this scene? Look at the tip-ups and the moss-covered forest floor, the lichen everywhere, the fallen trees and the cavities that they create, the coarse woody debris that is everywhere. There's a mosaic of old trees and young trees. This complexity is not only beautiful, to my mind, it also creates resilience and harbors incredible amounts of biodiversity. This is what forests actually want to look like if they're left alone. And it's all about complexity, a word that I keep returning to. Complexity comes naturally, simply by taking a step back and letting multiple generations of a living system grow, die, and regenerate without removing anything from that system. Viewing forest health through the lens of habitat rather than board feet can be defined in part by the amount of coarse woody debris that's present. And in a healthy temperate northern forest like the one that we live in, up to 30% of total woody biomass in an entire system, an entire forest, is in the form of coarse woody debris. This complex forest structure supports a myriad niche habitats often absent from young and managed forests. And with those niche habitats come countless species that evolved to rely on them. Vast interconnected landscapes that include wild, complex forests offer the best hope for wildlife to survive and adapt to climate change. But what about the forests themselves? Wild resilience has a lot to do with what happens below the surface, not only above it. In a wild forest, where soil is left completely undisturbed and complexity, again, that word, increases, and vast mycorrhizal networks help trees, especially older ones, that's important to note, share carbon between one another and even between different species. This was recently featured in a brilliant New York Times article that was published just a week ago, and I recommend everyone checking it out. These mycorrhizal networks become more connected the less disturbed a forest is, and they help forests react to and survive stress. And we've recently learned that these underground networks actually help share resources between species and may even help trees communicate. As crazy as that sounds, this is a fascinating and an emerging area of science that holds a lot of promise. So I want to return to the context map. If you recall, approximately 3% of the Northeast landscape is permanently conserved as wild. And again, less than 1% of the entire region, far less than 1%, is old growth. So now you have a better idea of what sets wild forests apart from managed forests and why they're different and why they're integral to climate change and biodiversity. It stands to reason we need more of them. So how much? Northeast Wilderness Trust is a member of Nature Needs Half, and we're a staunch supporter of the 30 by 30 initiative, which calls for 30% of the entire planet being conserved as wild with no extractive uses. And it's also a stepping stone to Half Earth and 50 by 50. Can such initiatives be applied in New England? I think they can. And Wildlands and Woodlands, which we're of course also a proud member of, calls for at least 7% of the landscape to be wild, or 10% of all conserved forests. And while those percentages are less than 30, after 100 years of incredible conservation, we are not even yet at 7%. So it is a great place to start. And I encourage everyone listening to this to bring these global and regional initiatives to life in your local communities. These are important conversations that must happen now. So I got 2 slides left, and Northeast Wilderness Trust is the only regional land trust in the Northeast with an exclusive focus on wildlands. We now conserve, as Kristin mentioned, over 37,000 acres of wilderness across the region, and we are scaling that up. And our strategic plan calls for adding 25,000 acres in the next 4 years. While there's important work to be done on public lands too, that just happens to not be our focus. So I'm going to focus on private land conservation. And I want to start with a provocative statement. Land trusts owning land is not good enough. If a land trust is serious about conserving forests, and if they're serious about perpetuity, just as we ask private landowners to encumber their land with conservation easements, land trusts must do the same. Executive directors come and go, staff changes, missions change over time, boards change. And what does that mean for the land that you own? All land trusts should proudly donate conservation easements to other land trusts to ensure perpetual conservation. This is true for all conserved land, but especially for wildlands. Without a conservation easement, it is a matter of when, not if, trees will be cut on that property. So Northeast Wilderness Trust goes about conserving wilderness by buying conservation easements, by buying land, and by working with land trusts to do dual layers of conservation. And to that point, we recently launched the Wildlands Partnership, which is bringing to life the goal of Wildlands and the Wildlands and Woodlands initiative, and of course to respond to these incredible crises that we face. And we have 3 goals in the next couple years, and that's to work with land trusts to incentivize conserving wilderness. And our goal is to conserve 10,000 acres in partnership with local land trusts around the region. We're going to be doing that through targeting 5 important landscapes. And we're also launching a carbon program geared specifically towards wilderness as part of the partnership. And finally, I want to show 2 examples of ongoing projects that demonstrate wildlands and woodlands on the ground in action. The first is the Redington Project. In partnership with the Maine Appalachian Trail Land Trust, Northeast Wilderness Trust is conserving 3,500 acres that are part of a larger 10,000 acre managed woodland project. So in that case, the wildlands portion is making up about 30% of that total project. The second example is in partnership with the Forest Society of Maine, where we're raising funds right now to conserve 1,300 acres that are adjacent to the Appalachian Trail as wilderness. And that is part of a larger 20,000 acre managed woodland project. So in that case, about 5%. I'm sharing these 2 projects in particular because they are exciting examples of wildlands and woodlands on the ground happening right now. This is real progress, acre by acre, parcel by parcel. And the Northeast Wilderness Trust has over 15,000 acres of active projects like that in our pipeline. I want to conclude my presentation with a quote from Mary Bird Davis that really resonates with me. And it says, "We are between 2 forested worlds, the natural forest of pre-settlement North America and the recovered forest of the future. The earlier forested world is not dead. We are studying and struggling to preserve its living remnants. And we do not believe that the future forest is powerless to be born. These remnants, with our help, will benefit the seeds from which a renewed forest spreads." Every person listening to this presentation has a role in defining what the next chapter of New England is going to look like. If you work at a land trust, I urge you to consider setting aside at least 10% of every new project you do as permanently protected wilderness, and better yet, think about 30 or 50%. And ensure that the woodlands portions that you have are managed to the highest possible standards, and consult with New England Forestry Foundation to learn more about exemplary forestry. And if you're here as an interested citizen, I urge you to contact your local land trust and tell them that you care about wilderness. And finally, if you are a philanthropist or a representative of a foundation, you literally make all of this work possible, both on the wildlands and the woodlands side. And from my biased perspective, I of course urge you to make wildlands a primary focus of your giving. You can learn more about what Bob and Neff and me and Newt are working on at our respective websites, and I hope you'll join the effort to conserve more wildlands and more exemplary managed woodlands across New England. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, I'm back. We have lots of questions, 50 in fact. And I've tried to group them together and a few themes. So if we can have both John and Bob join me on the screen, then I think we can start this last section after 2 very good presentations with a little conversation in the Zoom universe we all live in. It's good to see some people I know on the Q&A too. Shout out to Rick Vanderpool from Antioch. I haven't seen you in decades. All right, so I'm going to start with a question about carbon credits. There's several of them, and I will ask one of them, which is, Are carbon trusts or voluntary carbon credits a scam? Or are they an opportunity for the landowner to realize a financial return on forest land, which may not require logging trees for wood as a commodity, and instead allow their owner to be able to leave trees to grow older? Is this a model that makes sense in light of the climate emergency? So I think if you could both comment a little bit more about carbon credits, particularly the sale of them and how that relates to private landowner.
Bob, do you want to start on that and I can chime in?
Sure, and I think part of that question was oriented towards voluntary credits. So you may have seen an article in Bloomberg in the last week that really took this issue to task, and our friends at the Nature Conservancy to task as well. I think it's a viable path forward. And it surprises me that on one hand, people say we're harvesting too much, and then they make the argument that we shouldn't give people credits because they're not going to harvest. So I don't think they understand the world of the private forest landowner. And when you do understand that, you can see, I think, how credits to them can be helpful for them doing a better job.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I'll just speak briefly on our personal relationship with carbon. Northeast Wilderness Trust is engaged in the carbon market. We've sold credits on the California regulatory market, but we've also engaged in the voluntary market, as Bob was just talking about. And through our Wildlands partnership, we are hoping to encourage land trusts that we're partnering with to work on or in that voluntary market. And in those cases, again, I'm only speaking from Northeast Wilderness Trust's perspective, every project that is enrolled in our carbon program will have a Forever Wild easement on it. And I think that that's real permanent conservation that makes a difference and guarantees that, at least for these projects, the landowners and the land trusts, in some cases, that get revenue from that are guaranteeing to both the company buying those credits and to the general public that those forests will be protected forever. So I think that there's an incredible value to be working in the carbon markets, and it's going to increase conservation quite a bit in our region.
Great, thank you. So there are two other questions related to the relationship between forests as a natural solution to climate change and renewables and wood use. So let's start with the renewable question. So the question is around renewable energy. Embracing renewable energy is important for reducing carbon emissions. There are land requirements for installing this type of infrastructure. Where does land for renewable energy like wind and solar fit into the woodlands wildlands models? How do we balance reducing carbon by preserving or managing forests against conversion of land to renewable energy sources that do not produce carbon emissions either? There's some definite concern around this question, and I'd love for both of you to address it if you can.
I can offer my not expertise opinion, but just my personal opinion. I think that there's a lot more pressure in southern New England for renewable energy and forests than there seems to be where I live in northern New England. I don't know what's happening on the ground so much, but it seems like there's a lot of, personally, it seems like there's a lot of opportunity for renewable energy in areas that are already developed, or brownfields, or examples like that. And I know that there's a lot of pressure for renewable energy, and forests are seen as an easy target. But it seems like if we come together, there could be and there should be solutions that don't involve taking forests down to build renewable energy.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. You know, it hurts to see a forest taken down to put solar panels up. You know, I understand we're trying to save the planet and produce renewable energy, but look, it's never going to be easy for me to see that. I think we need to do better. I can understand why the focus is to get things going and get it going fast and get it going cheaply and efficiently. And I guess I understand that, but now maybe it's time to change and stop cutting our forests down. Let's put them on buildings, parking lots, offshore, etc.
Okay, I think that will continue to be a tough debate. All right, questions about wood use. I think there were a number of people who had heard for the first time that using wood in buildings is an effective way to store carbon. So there's a question, how does building with wood rather than concrete or steel reduce climate change? How does wood used in buildings compare to live trees as far as storing carbon? And should we be using recycled plastic instead? Similar types of questions around burning wood for heat. So maybe you could comment a little bit on that, Bob.
Yeah, to make steel or concrete, you have to heat these materials up to like 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit. And a lot of time coal is used to do that. So to make that material, you put a lot of carbon in the air right at the beginning. It's called embodied energy. So you can look at a building and say, how much of embodied energy do we put in the atmosphere just to get the building up? So you can compare the steel beam to the wood beam, and the wood beam comes out a lot better in this. So that's the way the equation works, but the numbers have to be looked at. And every building is different, and how they design each building is different. I think they're going to get better and make them more embodied carbon efficient. But not every building's the same. So you have to kind of look at the building, estimate how much steel, estimate concrete, where it came from, how it's made, add that up and compare it to wood. When we do it, the wood looks really, really good. And you add that to the storage of carbon in the wood that's there. And hopefully you have a positive impact in the forest. You add the three up together, and that's where you get a good result.
Okay, great. And John, do you have any thoughts about minimizing wood use and how that might help the cause of wilderness conservation?
I mean, ultimately, we use a lot of wood as a society, and I think if we use less in the way that we use it is smarter, that's a good thing all around. So it's really all I can add, which is kind of a evasive maneuver, but that's what I'll go for that one.
All right, well, I'll give you another hard question then. So I'm sensing there's a number of questions of people who love wild places, love wildlands, but because they're ecologists, they worry about things like invasives. There's also a question about how do you feel about helping plant and animals relocating given climate change? Would they be considered invasives? So I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the approach of the Forever Wild easement and how it addresses adaptation needs.
Yeah, I'll speak a little to this, and I'll just say that there is not a perfect answer to this question. Not only is Forever Wild, a tiny piece of the landscape. So most of what we see as examples of invasives are on the managed landscape. But we also live in a time of incredible change. So there's just a lot of unknowns in this situation, or for this area. What we do know, I think to the best of my knowledge, is that invasives thrive on disturbance. And when we consider the fact that 97% of the landscape is disturbed in some way and is managed in some way, there's no wonder that there are invasives. They are filling a very needed void. When something gets disturbed, something needs to grow back, and invasives have a competitive edge. What we have found at Northeast Wilderness Trust through anecdotal observation, this isn't scientific or peer reviewed, is that on our preserves that we've owned for 20 or so years, invasives are not really a problem. And of course, I'm talking about plant-based, not emerald ash borer, for instance. We see invasives on some of our preserves, and we've been watching them every year, and they don't really move. They don't expand, they're not taking over. And what we found is in a forest with very little to no disturbance, with a closed canopy or just natural disturbances occurring, they've been relatively kept in check. Now, there's of course the whole other type of invasive species, which is very prevalent in southern New England and is moving up towards my world in northern New England, such as hemlock woolly adelgid and EAB. And in those cases, Northeast Wilderness Trust, of course, from our personal perspective, would still not do anything. We would be completely okay, although very sad, if a whole hemlock forest got taken away by hemlock woolly adelgid, and it would fall over and create an amazing amount of coarse woody debris over the course of time. And that's okay. The point of Forever Wild conservation is to allow nature to take control and to, really just see what happens when we don't do anything. There is a place for management in a lot of the landscape, and on these precious few places, we're just saying it's okay not to manage, and let's just see what happens.
Good, thank you. There are also some questions about bringing all of this up to scale. So how can we do it all faster? On the Forever Wild side, the question is, what economic incentives or funding programs do you envision to help small private forest lands become forever wild? On the exemplary forest side, the question is there possibility of new legislation that allows for these kinds of forest practices to take root on public lands or private lands, and the existing standards of SFI and FSC, are they helpful in meeting those practices? So I wonder if you can each comment on how to bring this to scale at a landscape level, even beyond what you're already achieving, which is impressive.
Bob, why don't you start, and then I'll follow up.
If my presentation today is anywhere near accurate, I'm anticipating that there's going to be a great need to find ways to mitigate climate change, and then we're going to be turning to our forest, and practicing better forestry and building with wood is going to be something that people are going to consider. We hope we can get policymakers to consider that. What I propose is that if we're lucky and we can get that attention, or we're talking about significant incentives to do that, that at the same time, in the same legislation, in the same discussion, we're talking about protecting wildlands as well. That it's not the forestry community trying to capitalize on a potentially positive benefit solely by itself. I think we should stick together on this one. This is going to be a short period of time. We're all lucky in a way that we're living in this time and we can do something really important for future generations, but we got to get it right. And we ought to think about how we work together to get it right.
That's a great point. John?
So on the Forever Wild side, there's a couple of things that are happening. The first is, much like building with wood and in what Bob is talking about, there is a recent incredible awareness of the power of natural climate solutions being led by great organizations like the Nature Conservancy that are talking about this on a global scale. And we know that the science shows that leaving forests alone is an effective and scalable and relatively cheap way to help with climate change. So around the region, there are processes taking place where people are thinking about this at the government level to implement wildlands. In Vermont, just in my home state, the state of Vermont has a document called Vermont Conservation Design, which calls for 10% of 9% technically of our forests to be old forests. And we recently passed a global warming solutions act that kind of ties this all together. And then there's also pushes, I think there should be more pushes to incentivize private landowners for doing Forever Wild conservation in tax abatement programs to better reward people for taking, especially small forest owners in Vermont, it's like 35 acres at least. Private landowners that conserve their land as wilderness in Vermont aren't eligible for our current use program. That's something that may be able to change in the future to help private landowners see economic incentives for that. What we're doing at Northeast Wilderness Trust to make this change and help land trusts do better work in their respective communities is this Wildlands Partnership Initiative. We're trying to reach private philanthropic dollars and help land trusts do this kind of work in their communities. So it's all about scaling up. It's what we spend all of our time doing. I imagine Bob and Kristin and myself, that's all we do, is have these conversations about how can we scale up, how can we do more work, better work, and quicker. And yeah, so we're working on it, and I would encourage everyone that has a local land trust in their community to be talking about these things, and encourage your land trust to be implementing exemplary forestry and doing more wilderness conservation.
All right, well, I think that's a great point to wrap up on. I think we are over time. Everyone has been patiently in their living rooms or in their kitchens making dinner. Maybe you have a beer by now. It's really critical that we work together, and I'm so glad to have you join these two perspectives in a more integrated way. So with that, I think we'll turn it back to David to conclude for the evening.
Hey, thanks very much, Kristin, for moderating and for shepherding all those questions. And thanks especially to John and Bob for sharing your thoughts, for conducting such a great conversation, and for heading us forward in a really positive way. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Last I checked, we still had over 300 people who were on this video and joining in this conversation. Please follow up with any of the speakers or any of us with further thoughts and questions. Thanks again to all. Good night and have a great trip back to your refrigerator or wherever you are going. Take care.
Take care, everyone.